inadvertently wiped out his beloved family and plunged into a spiral of guilt, depression, and cynicism. The runaway car nightmare had been one of the symptoms. Though the dreams had disappeared entirely several years earlier, they'd returned again with a vengeance in the last few months. Jack focused on the play of light on the ceiling from the street lamp in front of his building. On their way inside, its beams passed through the leafless limbs of the lonely tree planted between his house and the lamppost. As the night breezes blew the branches, it caused the light to flicker, projecting an undulating series of hypnotic Rorschach-like patterns. It made him feel alone in a cold, merciless universe. Jack felt his forehead. He wasn't sweating, but then he felt his pulse. It was pounding and rapid, somewhere in the 150 per minute range, a sign that his sympathetic nervous system was in a full fight-or-flight reaction typical after experiencing this brakeless car dream. What was unique about this particular dream scenario were the children. Usually, the dreaded focus was purely personal, like a flimsy guardrail running along a precipice, a solid brick wall, or a fathomless body of water filled with sharks. He turned his head to the clock. It was after 4 a.m. With his heart racing, he knew instinctively that there was no way he'd fall back to sleep. Instead, he gently tossed back the covers to avoid disturbing Laurie and slipped out of bed. The oak flooring was as cold as marble. He stood and stretched his stiff muscles. Despite being in his 50s, Jack still played street basketball whenever the weather and his schedule permitted. The evening before, in an attempt to harness his current anxieties, he played until he nearly dropped. He knew he'd pay a price in the morning, and he was right. He pushed himself through the pain and discomfort by bending over and holding his palms flat to the floor. Then he headed for the bathroom while musing about the children in his nightmare. He wasn't surprised by this fresh torture. The source of his current anguish, reawakened guilt, and threatening depression was a child. His own child, in fact, John Jr., JJ, as he and Laurie called him. The baby had arrived in August, a few weeks earlier than expected. But they'd been fully prepared, Laurie especially. She'd taken the whole experience in stride. In contrast, by the time the delivery was over some 10 hours later, Jack was as exhausted as if he'd been the one who'd given birth. Though he'd assisted with his 2 daughters, he'd forgotten how emotionally difficult the experience was. He was relieved that both mother and child were fine and resting comfortably. Things had gone reasonably well for the first month or so. Laurie was on maternity leave and enjoyed being a new mother despite JJ's nighttime fussiness. Jack's fears that the baby would be born with a genetic or congenital problem dissipated. He'd never admitted to Laurie that after the delivery and assurances that she was fine, he'd rushed to look over the pediatrician's shoulder. Panicked, Jack had checked the child's facies and counted his fingers and toes. He wasn't sure if he could handle a handicapped child, as guilty as he felt at the fate of his 2 daughters. He had struggled with the idea of having another child and whether he could risk the vulnerability and responsibility of parenthood, particularly if the child was disabled. He had even been reluctant to remarry. If not for Laurie's stalwart patience and unflagging support, he wouldn't have risked it. Deep down, Jack couldn't rid himself of the feeling that he was somehow fated to bring disaster to those he loved. He grabbed his bathrobe from the hook behind the bathroom door and padded down to JJ's room. Even in the darkness, Jack could appreciate the nursery's over-the-top decor thanks to his mother-in-law, Dorothy Montgomery, who'd pulled out all the stops for the grandchild she'd worried she'd never have. The baby's room was gently lit by several nightlights at baseboard level. Hesitantly, Jack approached the white eyelet-swathed bassinet. The last thing he wanted to do was wake the baby. Getting him back to sleep after the last feeding had been a struggle. With little of the nightlight's illumination reaching into the depths of the bassinet, Jack couldn't see much. The baby was on his back, hands splayed out to the sides at 45-degree angles. His fingers were clenched over each thumb. Some light glinted off the child's forehead. His eyes were lost in shadow, but Jack knew that beneath them were dark circles, one of the early symptoms of his problem. The dark skin had developed.